Hi, everybody.
It was just fun.
Welcome to the first Tenant.
I'm telling you, I've worked so many jobs. I've worked as a.
Welcome, welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Feel free to drop your name and where you're joining us from in the chat today. Hi, Ben. We have a lot of folks joining us today. It's good to see everyone. We have my colleague Brooke here in DC. We have Denise joining from Boise, Chris from Sonoma. Hi, Chris. Let's see who we got on camera today. Hi, Claudia. Hi, Ramsey.
Hi, Sid.
Give me just a quick second, friends. We'll get started in just a second. We have, let's see, we have Ben from Nevada, we have AJ from Wisconsin, Marsh joining us from Oregon. Hi, Mrs. B. And we have Claudia from Michigan. Awesome. So we'll give it like another few minutes to allow folks to come in.
Right.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. We're going to have a lot of people in here today, and I'll repeat this later as well, but if you can just mute yourself, please, so that we can make sure that we're able to hear the Assistant Deputy Secretary today. Thank you, thank you. All right, we have Melody joining us from Texas. Hi, Melody. We have Mrs. Kanitha from Tennessee, Kisu from San Francisco, V from Missouri, Dr. Bambi, hello, from Atlanta, Myra from oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, I butchered that. Myrata, sorry if I butchered that, from Massachusetts.
It's okay, I've been called worse.
No, how do you pronounce it?
It's Myrta.
Marta, okay, awesome.
Yes.
Thank you.
No
Thank
problem.
you for joining us. And then we have Kathy joining us as well from Massachusetts. Oh, sorry, I cut you off.
Hi, Sid.
Hi, Miss Jerry. Thanks for joining us.
No problem.
Awesome. We have Nicole from New Jersey. All right, I'm going to give it another minute or so. Excuse me.
So I'll mute us while your mom's leaving, and then I'll unmute you after that.
Awesome. We have Benjamin or Angela from Wisconsin. Awesome. I hope you're all having like a wonderful holiday season, by the way. I know it's starting to get a little bit colder here in DC, so hopefully you are getting some nice weather where you're from.
Yeah, it's getting cold. This is Ramsey from Wisconsin. It's getting colder here too.
Sorry, Ramsey, can you say that one more time?
It's getting colder here in Wisconsin too, so yeah.
Oh, nice. I wish we got snow. We haven't gotten snow in DC yet, but hopefully soon. Cool. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. There's still some people coming in, but I'll just ask my colleagues to help me out when they get a chance, but y'all can continue to introduce yourselves in the chat in the meantime, and thank you again for joining us today. My name is Sid Betancourt, and I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer with the Coalition, and you are attending Tenant Talk Live. And for those who are newer to Tenant Talk Live, this is a meeting where we provide opportunities for residents and tenants to connect not just with NLHC, but with one another, to learn best practices around influencing federal housing policy, and also take that back and lead in your communities. So yeah, today's Tenant Talk Live will be a primer on HUD's Section 3 program, and we have the honor of having Assistant Deputy Secretary Michele Perez with us today. But before I invite her onto our virtual stage today, I'm going to go ahead and just provide a quick reminders and some logistical things. So first, this is just a reminder, if you want anything from this call, the recordings, the chat, any of the links that are shared, you're going to want to make sure that you're signed up to receive NLHC emails, and particularly the email called The Connection, which goes out every Friday, and that'll have everything for you. Gabby just dropped that link in the chat. If you registered for this call, you should already be receiving those emails, but if you're not, feel free to ping me and we can add you to that list. And then I do have the community agreements for us. Ooh, I thought I had them pulled up, friends. I'm so sorry, but they're going to be up in just a second. I usually have them prepped, but I'll have them up in just a minute. Okay, there you go. So here are the community agreements that we've had for 2023. So again, just the platinum rule: treat others the way they want to be treated. So in other words, consider how other folks want to be treated and how that might differ from how you want to be treated. Really important, since we're in the virtual space, we want to make sure that folks are muting their mics if they're not speaking. Always listen with an open mind and empathy. And if you have spoken already or asked a question already, we just want to make sure that we give other attendees the space to share their questions or thoughts. And we'll be but we'll be building off of these agreements next year. So if you want to have a say in these, we're going to have a whole Tenant Talk Live dedicated to community agreements for folks. Cool. So if you have any feedback on those, again, you can feel free to email me and give me any feedback. And then lastly, just please make sure if you have any questions, we will be taking questions in the chat, and we'll be asking folks if they want to ask questions live. But because there's so many of you in here, we want to make sure that we're using the feature to raise your hand. So if you're on your desktop, the way to access that is by using the bar at the bottom of your screen. It should say raise hand. I can't access it right now, but there should be a feature down there that allows you to raise your hand. Cool. And again, we ask that you stay muted if you're not speaking. We really want to make sure that we don't mute you all, because we want to make sure that you get the opportunity to speak up. But there's a lot of you in here, and we want to make sure that we have time to get through everything. So we're here for you if you are here for us. But yeah, that's all I have, and I will now hand it over to Michele Perez, who is joining us today to learn a little bit more about Section 3.
Thank you so much, Sid. Hi, everybody. I am glad to be here. I really appreciate the invitation and the fact that 92 and counting are coming online to have this conversation with me on Section 3 on behalf of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development is something that I'm very, very grateful for and appreciate the opportunity. Just so you know a little bit about me, I actually started working for HUD back in 1999. I worked in the Chicago regional office, and at the time I was a community builder, and I also helped to enforce Davis-Bacon prevailing wages across the entire Midwest region. So the work of HUD is something that I've grown up with, so to speak. I've been in this, doing this work for a long time, and now I'm leading the office here. Well, not here, I'm in Seattle today, but in Washington, D.C., I'm leading the office that I actually started my career with back in 1999. So really glad to be here, and jump right to it. We'll make the most of the time that we have together because I know I definitely want to make time for questions and for conversation. So if you could just sort of skip through the next slide, which is just another picture of me. Yeah, we can go past that one. Um, and I want to walk you a little bit through the agenda. So I know that there are a lot of questions, and what we've begun to do, especially thanks so much to NLIHC and the coalition writ large for giving us some heads up on what the issues are, what the concerns you're having, what you want to discuss. So we've tried to organize this presentation, to be succinct and to the point, and in plain English. And second, so that we can get to the point at the end of this presentation where we can actually have a conversation and I can answer as many questions as possible. So the agenda, as you can see here, focusing on worker empowerment, the point of Section 3, also good jobs, living wages, and community investment, and also really getting into the meat of Section 3. What information that's changed, what hasn't changed, what it is, what it isn't, what's most important from our perspective that we think you should know, and also in a resource listing at the end. So we'll make sure that you have a whole bunch of links and other resources for information to follow up, whether it's with me directly or any member of my team. And I know several of them are on the line with us now. So I may on occasion ask them to tag team for help. All right, next slide. Thanks so much, Sid, for your help with that. So let's just get to it. This is a cornerstone, I think, of the Biden-Harris administration, and one definitely of Secretary Fudge, who's spoken often about how important Section 3 is for her. And I think I wanted to ground this conversation with each of you on the three main values of what we believe our work calls for and that you deserve as customers and clients and partners and stakeholders in the work that we do together. The first is obviously trust. The second goes a little bit to the customer experience, the experience of the people who these programs were intended to serve. And the third one is accountability. How are we holding our end of the bargain with you in terms of accountability and ensuring that we are doing the work that is so critically needed for us to accomplish? So I'll start with a quote, and I apologize, I'm going to read it verbatim, but I think it was written so well in an executive order issued by President Biden in December of 2021 that I wanted to start with it to give a sort of framing of how we're going to engage in this conversation about Section 3. In this executive order, it was actually called Improving Customer Experience, he wrote, "The government must be held accountable for designing and delivering services with a focus on the actual experience of the people who it is meant to serve." That I can't even underscore is the value and the importance around the Section 3 program. And I also realized that for many of us, I came into this role as an appointee in February of 2021, that the Section 3 conversation is one that has been happening long before I stepped into this role. And when I started in February 2021, one of the first things that was brought to my attention by the team that I work with is there was a rule change. And the rule change had some profound changes that we were still learning about, that we needed to talk to our partners internally and externally about what they thought it meant to them. And so I'm also going to ground this conversation with the intention behind Section 3. And here again, I'll read verbatim from the actual regulation because it inspires the conversation we need to have. "To ensure that the employment and other economic opportunities generated by federal financial assistance for housing and community development programs shall, to the greatest extent feasible, be directed toward low and very low income persons, particularly those who are recipients of government assistance for housing." So the idea here is if we are investing all of these dollars in construction and development and rehabilitation, then we should ensure that the funding that goes to the companies that do business in these communities, whether they're grantees, whether they're contractors, whether they're partners, that they have an expressed and intentional prioritization of ensuring that the people who are from the communities, who are local to the communities, who have been the beneficiaries of the programs, have a vested interest in ensuring that they get the economic opportunities, the training, the education, and the job skills to be able to contribute to the development of those programs. So that rule change is what we're going to talk a little bit about. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about an executive order that was pulled in, chaired by the Vice President Harris, and it was called the Task Force on Worker Organizing and Empowerment. That task force basically was a complete demand list, if you will, on all of the concerns that residents, that unions, that worker centers, that think tanks had about Section 3 monitoring, compliance, and enforcement. And when all of the different federal agencies were called to the table, this was the first expectation that sort of outlined all of the concerns that were raised. What's interesting about the concerns, and I'll tell you what each of them were, one was specifically monitoring, compliance, and enforcement, was that it was as a consequence of the U.S. Housing Act, Section 3 of 1968. So this program has been around for over 55 years. And with this rule change, it was important for my office in working with the internal program offices to figure out how are we going to communicate this to our HUD grantees, public housing authorities, localities, cities, towns, counties, developers. How are we going to establish the processes and the systems to ensure that we could be accountable in reporting back progress of the Section 3 program to you, or vice versa, reporting back places where there's improvements to be made, because we know that there are a lot of that as well. I think part of the challenges is that we didn't really have a large sense of infrastructure. There hadn't been given a lot of thought with the rule change in terms of what were the systems that we needed to be able to report back the information that you need to know, i.e., where are the jobs, who's getting hired, what percentage of construction projects are going to Section 3 workers, how do I identify myself as a Section 3 worker, who do I reach out to, how do I self-certify. There requires us to have constant communication with all of the communities that we engage with so that it's clear how the program is supposed to work and that there's a process for us to validate that it is or is not working in the way in which it was intended. I think the obvious challenge that you may also know is that the law is written in such a way, and I want to highlight to the greatest extent possible. For those of us who are optimists, to the greatest extent possible means that we can reach for the stars, do as much as we possibly can to ensure that opportunities for economic empowerment, for job training, for employment, for contracting opportunities go to low-income people. In some places, that interpretation to the greatest extent possible, and maybe more to the cynics of us, is, well, what is the least amount that we have to do to demonstrate compliance with this? And that's a challenge that we have to balance, because the reference to the greatest extent possible, we are trying to work with both stakeholders, grantees, but also residents and tenants to say, what is a reasonable and a meaningful impact to executing Section 3? And how do we ask our grantees in particular to prove that they are in fact doing the work to the greatest extent possible? One of those changes is the number of people hired. That's how we used to count it. From an impact perspective, that wasn't good enough, because in many cases, again, to the cynics of the folks that were working with this program, they could potentially hire someone for a day, a week, a month, and then let them go, but not really demonstrably have an impact on economic opportunities for that person, their family, or the community. So we've transitioned through this change of the rule to the total number of labor hours annually. So every single grantee has to tell us on an annual basis, have they demonstrated that up to 25% or more, again, to the greatest extent possible, have been working on Section 3 projects? Well, in order to do that, we have to know how we're identifying the projects, how we're tracking it, how we're reporting it, how that information is transparent to all of us, and ensure that there's access and outreach to those opportunities for the folks that are looking for these kinds of jobs. How much is enough? What is a demonstrable impact? That's something that we'll have a conversation about, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the challenges that we've been experiencing. And frankly, I'm very curious and interested to hear about the challenges that you yourselves have been experiencing so that we can think through how to solve some of these challenges together. The three items that we talked about before that the Task Force on Worker Organizing and Worker Empowerment required HUD to do, which is what we're doing, is addressing communication and outreach with residents, local unions, worker centers, in monitoring compliance and enforcement, in talking about the rule changes. The second was ensuring that there was direct contact and in connection to HUD offices. So I don't know if you all know that there are 64 offices, field offices across the country, the Office of Field Policy and Management, the office that I lead, who have staff there to talk to you about outreach, engagement in whatever communities you come from, who will engage with you, do this kind of session for you and your local community so that we can help work together to help spread the word about what Section 3 is. Because unfortunately, those of us in Washington, D.C. use government speak for so long that we've lost the point of what Section 3 is. It's about job opportunities. It's about accountability of the government in terms of our investments in communities. And if we're not using really plain language and avoiding terminology and phrasing that doesn't really mean a lot to a lot of people, then we're missing an opportunity. So know that if you go to hud.gov/local, thank you, Brooke, for putting that in the chat in advance. That gives you a listing of every single one of the 64 field offices of HUD across the country, who their field office directors are, what their phone numbers are, what their email addresses are, because we want to first and foremost encourage you to engage with them, to have this conversation, not generally. I know I'm having a very large-scale national conversation, but specific to your local communities, where you are and what you're doing. Those are the folks with whom I invite you to have a conversation with and to increase the capability and the power of what the Section 3 program is. The third thing is federal interagency partnerships. One of the things that we learned quickly is the Department of Housing and Urban Development didn't get a lot of money with all of this Build Back America funding. We did get some money, but not a lot in comparison to other federal agencies. And so the other part of the Section 3 program is not just a function of how much money is HUD getting and how is HUD spending it. Honestly, it's about finding all the money in all the places and every single federal agency that we can partner with together to ensure that residents of public housing or people who are living on HUD subsidized assistance can have the benefit of that kind of job opportunity, job training, job certification, and contracting. So I can tell you, we've been spending a lot of time working with the Department of Labor, with the Employment and Training Administration and their Youth Build program, the Small Business Administration and the Department of Commerce, the Minority Business Development Administration, about how to ensure that small businesses get the resources that they need. These aren't things that HUD is expert at, and we want to be honest with you about that. And so it's our job to connect you with those agencies who actually have that expertise and can give you the kind of support that is necessary. Frankly, that's part of how we build back trust. We've worked with EPA. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation, just as examples of ensuring that there's actual connections, not just with the letter of the Section 3 rule, but also the spirit. How do we connect people to jobs? How do we connect people to good, livable wage jobs that can help them grow and be sufficient for their families and for their communities and grow businesses? So next slide. I just talked through all of those, so apologize, Sid. I went through some of them, but just quickly, just to review it quickly, reviewing HUD's current Section 3. And for what it's worth, this report to the president that I just referenced, which was chaired by Vice President Harris and co-chaired, actually, vice-chaired by the former Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh. It's available online. So you actually can go online and get the full text of the document, and it stipulates for every single federal agency what the expectations and the requirements were as a consequence of feedback that many of you in different forms and functions across the country have asked the federal government to support worker empowerment. These are the three that are named in that report that HUD is responsible and accountable to report back on. And these are the things that we're doing today. And this conversation is honestly part of that commitment. Okay, next slide. Which goes then to the next conversation about this administration and the commitment to advancing racial equity and justice. One of the concerns around equity is that we have to be honest about where we came from, how we got to the situations in which we are, and the origins, even as we just talked a little bit ago about Section 3. It's 55 years old. It was as a consequence of 68. There was a lot going on in this country at that time. And President Biden, on his first day in office, January in 2021, issued a presidential memo. And in it, it's actually called Redressing Our Nation's and the Federal Government's History of Discriminatory Housing Practices and Policies. You can't move forward if you don't acknowledge and understand where you've been. And so 1968 was a significant year, not just because it was as a consequence, the passage of the Housing Act to the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but it was also an acknowledgement on the part of the government of the practices and policies that have contributed to disinvestment in the communities that we're supporting today. I don't know if you're aware, but I think it's useful just for context. We make it a practice at HUD to talk about this with our staff. Between 1934 and 1962, 98% of FHA insured loans went to white families. So this idea of disinvestment and intergenerational wealth and economic opportunity are not just trite words. They actually mean something. And I'm grateful to have an opportunity to discuss with you the path that we're taking to help right those wrongs, that it's going to take time to do that. But this is a commitment of this administration, of our secretary, and of the HUD team to really mean what we say when we say these kinds of things. That it's just not sloganeering. It actually is, for many of us, the whole reason why we came into public service. For me in particular, when I joined on board, it was in the midst of the COVID pandemic. And one of the things that we talked about, and one of the requirements that the Biden-Harris administration asked us to pay attention very early on was with response to health equity and how we ensure the health and safety of the communities that we serve, particularly because so many of us were working with communities that were disproportionately susceptible to infection, transmission, and mortality of COVID. Well, the other part of that conversation is not just the health implications, but also the economic recovery, the jobs, the businesses. That too is something that we need to be very intentional about, especially when we're talking about an equitable response to the pandemic. It's not just making sure people are safer, it's also making sure that people are more resilient so that we are stronger and more capable of withstanding these kinds of challenges without seeing the kinds of negative effects to our own family members and communities across the country. And so part of the intent behind this executive order and in connection with the Section 3 program is how do we make a top priority for employment, for training, and for contracting opportunities? That's what Section 3 means. For Section 3 business concerns, another conversation I think well worth having is how do we define what a Section 3 business is? And I'm going to read for you what those criteria are because I don't know how knowledgeable y'all may be about. I know I learned a lot when I first came to HUD, but they are 51% or more owned or controlled by low or very low income persons. Greater than 75% of labor hours are performed by low or very low income workers, or equal to or greater than 51% are owned or controlled by current residents of public housing or Section 8. So this gives you an idea that these are folks that have the business acumen and the desire to ensure that they have the benefit of all of this incoming money into their local communities by contracting, in many cases for local community dollars, whether it's through the city, the county, the state, or even the local housing authority, and one day maybe even becoming federal contractors or becoming something other than a small business and growing and providing jobs for their community. So this idea of connecting housers to economic empowerment is something that we are on a journey, right? We're on a journey together with our program partners because in many cases, maybe in larger housing authorities, they have greater sophistication around providing job training or economic opportunities, but in some smaller housing authorities who may not necessarily have the staff or the expertise, that is a challenge. And so this is another place where I believe, and my team is working hard to ensure that we are providing you with those resources as well. We'll go to the next slide because I also think it means understanding what Section 3 is and what it's not. So I told you a few minutes ago that when I started at HUD, the rule had changed. And many of you may know that it used to sit both outreach, education, as well as compliance and enforcement in the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. Some of you may know that equal opportunity quite literally meant the Section 3 program. When I arrived, I learned from my team, and so again, this is February 2021, that the program had been moved, and it had been moved. Outreach, education, as well as reporting sat in my office, the Office of Field Policy and Management. But the expectations around compliance, monitoring, and enforcement would sit with each of the respective program offices. The idea being that the folks who are doing regular monitoring, evaluation of the programs, who have the most complex understanding and knowledge of the programs, the HUD staff who are doing the oversight and enforcement, that this should be something that they do in addition to all of the other types of enforcement and monitoring activities that they undertake. So this meant, ergo the handshake here, that we needed to partner with them to understand how are they, each of the different programs at HUD, whether it's the Office of Public Housing, the Office of Community Planning and Development, the Office of Multifamily Housing, how are they looking at program compliance, evaluation? How are they making assessments in terms of enforcement? So that we could be, my office, so this is all still in HUD, so more of how the spaghetti is made, I think, than is necessary, but I think useful for you to understand how to then navigate and interact with each of the programs, because FPM's job is to literally touch each of those programs to understand how they're considering their program and what success looks like. And we'll talk a little bit about more what that means. We talked a little bit about the move from labor hours or hiring to labor hours, but I think a few other points that are useful for you to be aware of is race and gender. I think that's a question that comes up quite a bit. And what our team wanted you to know is that the Section 3 rule itself is race and gender neutral. Meaning grantees are not required to incorporate race or gender-based metrics into their Section 3 efforts. Truth be told, though, given the makeup of HUD programs, I think it's important for us to be conscious of the individuals with whom we're serving and to ensure that racial equity and economic opportunity are applied in all of our programs, but it's not explicitly named in the same way for the Section 3 program. Contractor labor requirements. This too is, I think, something that is useful to share, that again, the 25% benchmark that we're establishing for participation in the program isn't specific to an individual contractor or an individual project. It's for the grantee over the course of an entire fiscal year. That's a really interesting little nuance because it's not necessarily something that's easy for you to understand, because it presumes that you know 100% of the activities, right? The total number of labor hours that any one organization is going to enter into in a given year. So this is where the transparency that we back to where we started on accountability, it matters. This is where our partnership, FPM, HUD, with each of the program offices and with each of the grantees to talk about what this looks like in your community is going to be key, because we can't be honest about how we improve until we talk about specifically where are the areas for improvement and what are the strategies in the plan to then improve that. I think the only other point I wanted to make on this slide is part of what was called out in that worker organizing and worker task force from Vice President Harris, which is prioritization does not necessarily mean automatic hiring. And this is the complaint we get a lot, and I think it's an unfair one, from the businesses and contractors with whom we work, that it is key for us to ensure that the folks who apply to these jobs have the necessary qualifications to do this work. By the sheer nature of who the communities with whom we're working, it means then we need to spend time on education, training, and to become certified to do the kinds of jobs that that the federal funding is coming down. As an example, lead-based paint abatement. That's an industry for which certification is necessary. Training is required. You can't actually do the work until you have that. So we really need to talk about how are we spending federal funds, not just to do the work, but also to pay for training and outreach. And that's something that we're working closely with EPA and with HUD's own Office of Healthy Homes and Lead-Based Paint Abatement. I would also say partnering with the unions has been another significant improvement there, because if we're serious about ensuring folks have long-term options to job careers and paths that get progressively more benefits and more money, then working with partners such as LIUNA or IUPAT with sheet metal workers, right? How do we encourage participants to join? Oh, and I'll get to that, Carrie. Sorry, I'm doing my best to not look at the chat as it pops up, but we'll talk about how we're explicitly working with community action agencies on $3.5 billion worth of money that's going to them through the Department of Energy. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But in this case, I'm talking about working with unions for both pre-apprenticeship programs and certified apprenticeship programs. So folks get trained and get the opportunity to get into career fields that actually have longevity and benefits. Construction only is another factor I think that folks oftentimes get confused with the requirements. Oops, we're jumping things.
Sorry, it like went.
No worries. It's a good encouragement for me to speed it up so that we spend time on conversation. But construction is not limited to the only things that Section 3 is applicable to. It's also for administration and operations. So the spirit of the Section 3 rule is not just the letter. And I'll give you an example. I learned from a large housing authority who also negotiated in their contract with their cell phone provider. It was a large housing authority, and they were giving a lot of money through this contract through their cell phone provider. And they put in their contract a stipulation that this very large cell phone provider not only train, but also hire a certain number of people from the housing authority on an annual basis. That was a condition of the agreement. So it doesn't necessarily count towards the 25% benchmark in terms of the total labor hours for any given year, but it definitely is, it demonstrates the spirit of what Section 3 intends to do. So we'll stop there and jump to the next slide on accountability. We talked a little bit about that. And I wanted to say a couple of things on this topic, which is we've spent at FPM, at HUD, at Field Policy and Management, a whole lot of time doing internal training. This rule has been in effect now for 2.5, almost 3 years. And it was most important for us to work with the grantees first, so that there was no point in which any of them said, oh, I didn't understand what I was supposed to do. I was unclear on what the expectations were. The rule itself, besides the change, the intent of the rule still is true in many ways. How are you demonstrating that folks are getting jobs through the expenditure of HUD funding in your program administration? What we added was, what are other ways that you are supporting that work, not just in jobs? Because again, to the point of qualification, certification, and training, are you working with local employers, with your local workforce center, with community action agencies, as was noted in the chat, with other organizations, to make sure that the folks who are eligible for these jobs are ready to actually get them? From a small business concern, we talked a little bit about that. You know, we're hearing the number one concern, and this was raised by Section 3 businesses. We had a listening session with them, a group of them, and they said capital. We need help with capital investment. We need help with licensing and bonding and insurance. We need to establish more personal relationships with the grantees of HUD so that we get proper and formal notification on requests for proposals so that we can submit a proposal. And if we don't get a proposal, we'd love to have a debrief with the housing authority or the grantee to find out what was insufficient about our proposal. These are the kinds of activities that are not stipulated explicitly in the Section 3 rule, but it demonstrates the spirit of the goal. What is the impact of the Section 3 program? So we're spending time on doing that as well. As I said before, working with the Small Business Administration, figuring out what kind of free training, what kind of support they're giving, mentorship, grant opportunities, business plan support for small businesses. This is something that we, HUD, can absolutely connect from the Small Business Administration and deliver to HUD programs. And that's something that we're doing regionally and locally across the country. Which gets then to the point, where is the data? We can go to the next slide. Where is the data? How is it being reported? How frequently is it being reported? To whom is it being reported? This is where I imagine many of you might have questions, and they're reasonable. They're absolutely fair questions. And I am going to acknowledge that we've got some room, major room for improvement in that respect. So I said before in the last slide that we spent some time training and educating our grantees so that they know how to report, what the expectations of the new rules are. Well, what you may also know or not, depending on your knowledge of this program, is that we, HUD, have not built a system for the Office of Public Housing so that housing authorities could actually enter this information on an annual basis so that we can then publicly report back to you, this is what it looks like in a housing agency, in a locality, in a region, or even nationally. We've established this benchmark of 25%, but we haven't actually tested it. It is a fair and reasonable question for you to say, well, Michele, what percentage of housing authorities have met that benchmark? Well, because we've also used a sort of construct of the spirit and the letter of the law, some housing authorities have well met or exceeded that benchmark, and some have not. And where they have not, then they're giving us qualitative assessments on what in fact they are doing. Are they doing job training? Are they doing job fairs? Are they working with grantee, with residents on skill sets or resources to support them? I'll say for a number of folks, the issue honestly isn't job training. There are lots of qualified, competent individuals to do the work. It's childcare. And maybe that's kind of support that's needed. But we also recognize that it costs money for them to do that. And it requires partnerships at the local level that they may not have. And this is where, again, if I haven't made the point clear, where your local HUD field offices, in the same way we're reaching out to you to have this conversation, we're also reaching out to the housing authorities and making those introductions. I'll jump on the topic of the community action agencies. The Department of Energy had about $3.5 billion for weatherization programs. And they give that money largely through community action agencies. And truth is, they didn't know how to expand access. And so we partnered with 5 housing authorities as a pilot last year. It's going to grow considerably in this fiscal year, FY24, because what it did, it got folks in the Jobs Plus program paid training and then guaranteed jobs at the end of the program. This is an example of the partnership at work, and we want to do more of that. There's a lot of money available. We did something similar with lead-based paint abatement. We found that a number of cities and counties across the country were giving money back to the federal government because they couldn't find lead-based paint abatement contractors to do the work. Just so you know, when they applied to the program, there were a certain number of units that were dangerous for children to live in. Lead-based paint is a danger for the health of families, especially small children. And so this was an example of us saying, hey, if we worked with EPA and worked with the Office of Healthy Homes, how do we identify the free resources and trainings so that folks can not just get trained, but also can start their own businesses and hire people to do that work where we know that that matchmaking with local agencies is going to help them spend their money. And the last example I'll give of that is Department of Transportation. They got a lot of money through the Infrastructure and Investment Act, through the Bipartisan Inflation Act. I always get this wrong. There's a lot of money on transportation, on roads and bridges. And here's another example where in their request for proposals where they're seeking folks to bid on these projects, we are including the definition of Section 3 in their local hire expectations, so that when folks are applying to get this money, if they identify the local housing authority or Section 3 participants as a local hire, people who they will train and support to get into that workforce, and they'll get more points on their application through the Department of Transportation. This is the work that we're doing on in the background. So I think it's going to be a combination, and I wanted to be very upfront with you about it, because it's not just a matter, and I'm not saying that the numbers don't matter, but it's not just a function of, are we meeting our benchmarks? Yes, we need to be able to report that nationally, regionally, and locally. And we will, once we invest in the IT solutions to do that. And HUD has made that a priority for this fiscal year. That has been something we've spent a lot of time on. We've also spent a lot of time for our CPD programs in ensuring that the data and the systems that exist, where they're entering how many labor hours in their local communities that they're hiring, or we're ensuring that the information is accurate, and we're pulling that information and showing it to our program partners at HUD. So yes, reporting and data transparency is important, but so too is the spirit of the Section 3 program, which leads us to the qualitative analysis of what success looks like. So I'll stop there on that topic and jump to the next slide. There aren't too many more, I promise, which goes to oversight and compliance. We talked about public housing, we talked about CPD. At the end of the day, we are working hand in hand with our program partners inside of HUD, so that when they're going out and doing oversight and compliance, they are actually asking, can we see a copy of the Section 3 reports that you have? So just because HUD hasn't established a system doesn't mean that the rule is not a matter of fact. Does it actually, I'll go further. I jointly signed a memo with Dominique Blom, who was the General Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Housing, sent it out to all the housing authorities in the country, stating that they have a responsibility to maintain the records of Section 3 compliance. Even though there's not a national database for them to enter that into so that we can report that more publicly and more transparently, they still have an obligation to maintain those records. So there is an opportunity for our HUD program executives who are going out and doing regular grant monitoring and routine compliance checks to look at the level of effort that they're undertaking and to come to some conclusions and recommendations, and even if necessary, findings in terms of where the work is not meeting either the spirit or the letter of the law, the qualitative or the quantitative requirements. And I'll also tell you that we are putting our technical assistance money behind it. NYCHA, as an example, is a agency for whom we wanted to ensure that they had the necessary protocols and processes, and they happily received technical assistance funding from us so that we can do more greater support. It's not a gotcha game. If we start playing it like that, then people will, it becomes a system that people don't believe, like there isn't the confidence and the faith in maybe this is me being an optimist. But if we provide you with support and assistance, and we show you ways in which to improve your operations, then the next time we come back around and do oversight or monitoring compliance, then again, why we spent the last couple of years doing training and education for our grantees, there's no place in which folks simply say, I didn't know, I wasn't sure how. They understand that these are our expectations and this is how we're going to engage. So we've spent sufficient time and energy on training and technical assistance internally. And I would tell you for FY24 and beyond, it's now moving to the more systemic oversight and compliance review, particularly because we anticipate by the end of FY24 having the data systems available to be able then to publicly show you neither, if this is the case for an agency, you neither met the quantitative or the qualitative analysis of those metrics. And we can work in partnership with the program offices then to derive what types of improvement strategies need to be developed. Okay. I think that leads us to the next slide, and I think it's like the last slides are just filler. Outreach and engagement. So this is where HUD FPM is doing that, using existing data to publicize. So training, outreach, and engagement. So again, I'll say here, just because we don't have the information to share with you doesn't mean the housing agencies don't. And in developing better relationships between Section 3 and advocates and tenants groups, we're happy to facilitate those conversations. Also, helping to familiarize Section 3 businesses with who the procurement directors are at their respective agencies, making introductions so that they understand who those vendors could potentially be. Because at the end of the day, in many cases, contractors, if you're looking to work with an agency, a lot is done, especially in small communities, based on relationships. And if you don't know who to call, then you don't know how to get on a short list of when issues or requests for proposals are going out. How do you get access to those proposals so that you can submit? So that is something that we want to help to facilitate. That is part of what we believe is our role in terms of outreach and engagement. I think I said most of these points. I think, like I said before, we talked about what the Department of Energy money. I'll speak a little bit on disasters. I think that's an element of this that we haven't talked a little bit much about, and I think is useful. We're seeing disasters, the community development block grant, disaster recovery funding. We're seeing locations across the country where disasters are hitting with more frequently and with far more effect. And so the federal government is giving funding to communities to specifically respond to those disasters. I would tell you for Puerto Rico, I was there not even 2-3 weeks ago talking actually about Section 3, and they have over $17 billion in recovery dollars that are going. And so the point there is, if there's $17 billion of disaster recovery to improve the community, how do we fast track residents and other low-income persons to opportunities? And so we are an FPM working with a nonprofit who is working on training, and forgive me, I don't remember the name, but I'm super impressed by the team that's leading this work. But they are training folks for disaster-related contracting opportunities. So this is an opportunity where we know that the people who are impacted have the most knowledge of the communities in which they are, and how can we set them up to then be competitive for disaster recovery jobs, because that is very necessary. It shouldn't have to be a whole bunch of folks coming out from other locations. This is a way in which we increase, as I said before, the resiliency of communities that are being impacted by progressively more dangerous climate impacts. And that gets us to our next slide.
I was gonna say really quickly too, I'm so sorry, Michelle, that I have to cut you off, but we only have like 8 minutes left in the call, and I want to make sure that,
yeah, no, I wish you would have said that sooner. There's no more slides.
Okay.
And the last comment I was going to make on resources. So the last slide, I've talked about all these things already. All of this we've talked about. So the last slide, that one, is resources. So certifications, resource hubs, guidance, and also public comment for the purposes of evaluating the Section 3 final rule, or the Section 3 benchmark, because we do have to evaluate that every 3 years. And so there'll come a point where, after we've presented you with all this information, where we'll seek public comment about, is 25% the right benchmark? How are folks performing against it? And what is the right number? That's something that we are going to constantly seek every 3 years. It's stipulated in the law to get feedback in that respect. So that's it. Sorry about that's it, but I appreciate your patience.
No worries at all. I just wanted to make sure that we got to at least one person. I know we have a few hands up. So unfortunately, I won't be able to get to everyone, and that's okay, because we're going to share the links that are available, and hopefully ways for folks to get in touch with not just you, but your colleagues. And the first hand that I saw up is Mrs. B, and I know Mrs. B probably has a lot of questions, but Mrs. B, if you can ask just one important one that like sticks out to you, then we can hopefully get to another one.
Thank you. I'm going to be considerate of others, and I won't ask all of the questions. I will ask the key questions, which are very, very critical. First of all, it's about, you talked about transparency and accountability, and you just breezed over data collection. When you eliminated the summary 6002 report, you're replacing it, but the new system is not in place. So what happened to all of that data that was under the summary report? That's number one. Number two, what happened to the complaints filed under summary 6002? Were they thrown out with the baby in the bathwater? What
No,
happened to those folks who filed Section 3 complaints? They are, what's that needs to be addressed. I
No,
can appreciate Assistant Deputy Secretary Perez that you inherited this mess from the previous administration, which killed training, employment, income, and contracting for low-income people. And that's a major concern for me. And I think it's important to keep it simple. That
understood.
all the dollars expended should be funds expended with multiple targets for achieving your goal. And how are you counting the hours of people in prison? Under the new rule, how is that being calculated?
Okay.
That's a concern. And my last question, and I'll let somebody else speak. In the states where you cannot ask somebody what they make, the wording in the definition of Section 3 business, it states nothing could be in conflict, should be construed to require the contracting and subcontracting of Section 3 business concerns. So how is that being addressed? If you can't ask, what is your income? How much do you make? How do you deal with that equal equity problem? And I'm going to relinquish the floor so that other people can express their concerns, but we need answers.
Yes, ma'am.
It's about the data.
Yes.
And you need to show us the compliance, who's complied, who hasn't complied. And under the new rule, only Section 8 RAD folks can participate. And the new rule needs to be simplified so everybody can understand. And when you come forward and speak to us, you should have a comparison chart, the old rule versus the new rule and the benefits.
So, ma'am, if
Because you gave a lot of information that most of these folks on this call do not understand.
well, that's.
Yeah. You have to keep it simple. You have to change the language in the rule so that everybody can understand.
So I'll say it very simply then, ma'am. The old rule was the number of people hired. The new rule is the total number of hours worked on an annual basis by the agency, which means then once the new rule took effect, any complaint related to the number of people hired was no longer applicable. The rule changed, right? So if they were looking retrospectively, if they were looking backwards, when the rule was the number of people hired, the Office of Fair Housing stopped taking any more complaints because the rule changed. And so they handed each of those concerns for the old rule, the complaints that were raised, to the individual program office. So at HUD, if you live in housing authority and you were submitting a complaint about a housing authority, it went to the Office of Public Housing and they evaluated those complaints and closed them out as appropriate. They resolved it, right? So that's what happened with all of those programs, with all of those complaints.
But I'm not going to take up the time. It's not true. I got written letters and confirmation from different PHAs where that didn't happen. But I'm going to let the other two people who have their hand raised speak to you. But that's not true.
Well, then I would love to.
No, you need to talk to Ramsey Lee and Mr. Williams, and I will send you that information.
Please
I promise you.
Thank you, Mrs. B. I think Michele has to leave like right at 7, so I'm gonna respect her time, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everyone. But is there a way to reach you or any of your colleagues, Michele, that were able to make sure that we make that connection for you, because I know we had a lot of questions in the chat, and I don't want
No,
to.
and I'll repeat the point that matters most, which is at the end of the day, having these conversations locally matter, right? What did this housing authority for this community, for this, what are contracting opportunities in this region, right? I'm talking at a very high level. I appreciate that. I think if you can contact my staff, there are 350 people all over the country in 64 field offices in every single state and in Puerto Rico. It's the Office of Field Policy and Management. It's at HUD.gov/local. You can even tell them Michele, Assistant Deputy Secretary, told them to call you, right? Because those are the folks who have the knowledge, the relationships, and the contacts to have these conversations with you, to work with local program offices to determine whether or not they've got the data. Mrs. Brown's point about where the data is now that the rule has changed, I stated it, I thought pretty plainly, we don't have that information because the systems don't exist yet. In this fiscal year, we intend to have those systems complete, and we intend on sharing that information publicly. I acknowledge in its infinite wisdom, the government changed a rule, but didn't have an IT system ready to set up to execute that rule. And we're working to correct that right now.
Ms.
Thank
Perez,
you
could
so
you
much.
take one more call, please? This is Mr. Dennis Williams, all the way from San Francisco.
I'll let Michele, would you be able to take that, or do you want to close us out for now?
No, please, please, Mr. Williams.
Oh, thank you. I didn't mean to barge in. Thanks for everyone on the call, especially ones in California. I'm Mr. Dennis Williams, sub chair of the Fillmore Merchants Collaborative, a member of my community's DAC committee, which is Development Advisory Committee, and also a real estate developer. We're in the middle of a $481 million redevelopment here at Plaza East, and a lot of our low-income housing in San Francisco is being redeveloped. We're having a problem with the SF HUD department in funding or even listening to our tenant council, resident council, as well as the tenant leaders, community leaders as well, as adhering to Section 3 as if it was like a dirty secret. Now that we found out of organized a bevy of plethora of Black business-owned businesses, men and women, where I'm asking, is anything can be done because we're in the pre-development stage to kind of remind SF, like you say, there's a lot of field offices. Some of your field offices need you to call and just give a heads up to, let's make sure that they're in compliance, because we have companies that the community has been organizing, protesting with HRC, which are Housing Rights Committee in San Francisco, like Kirkwood Plumbing, Sterling Framers, CIWS Plumbing. I can go on down the list, as well as myself. What do we do when when the Section 3 is not being adhered to, especially on a project so large, where we're missing out on being hired and also employing our youth and bringing an immediate economic impact to our communities? Again, it's $480 million at Plaza East. Down the street is $700 and something million, and Sunnydale projects is over $700 million. Now that's over $1 billion in the Black communities, and we are not even seeing 2% of not even contracts, but we want hours, lucrative, adequate hours. So if there's anything you can do to land
I'm going to raise the stakes in this. I'm going to raise the stakes in this because I saw a number of comments that folks were saying that even our local HUD offices are non-responsive in this regards, and that's unacceptable. Yes, ma'am. That's unacceptable to me. And so I'm going to make sure, Sid, we're going to share with you not only a list of each of the 64 field offices. I also want to include my small team based out of Washington, D.C. to be copied on all of those, so that you're not just sending out an email out in the dark to just some field office in wherever we might exist. We are also copying headquarters, my office in Washington, D.C., so that we can keep track of all of the contacts that are made to each of you out there, and we can ensure that each of them are responded to and resolved. I can't always promise you that the resolutions are going to be, that we're going to have to figure those out each step of the way with every single partner. But I can absolutely promise you that we will maintain records of those so that we can evaluate how responsive each of our field offices are, because it's not satisfactory to me that you're telling me that we are calling them and they're just not calling us back. That's not okay.
Well, they're at our tenant meetings, but I'm gonna let it go. Thank you, Ms. Brown. Thanks to everyone on the call, and even thank you, Ms. Perez, because your office was very diligent in helping us 3 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago. Please Google Plaza East Apartments, Dennis Williams, and you'll see how the HUD office in Washington, D.C. even got in front of stopping the development until things was straight. We're almost there. We just need a little bit more assistance in San Francisco Plaza East. Thank you much.
Thank
Thank you, everyone.
Assistant
Thank you
Deputy
so
President,
much.
just a sidebar. You use NYCHA as an example. Please be aware that NYCHA does not have a printed policy, Section 3 policy plan. They don't even have a Section 3 department. The chairperson of the City Council of New York asked NYCHA who is in charge of Section 3. And nobody knows who's on first or who's on second.
Which is
So
why,
that was
Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Brown, I didn't point them out as to say this is an excellent program. I pointed them out to say we are spending money to provide them with technical assistance that we know that they need to improve their program.
It's money not well spent. I can suggest something else, but we can talk offline.
Yes.
Noted, ma'am. Noted.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Michele, for joining us. And I'm sorry to cut us off abruptly, but we did go over a few minutes, and I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and to answer those few questions. And again, thank you for allowing us to connect with your team in DC, and I'll make sure that folks can follow up with myself, and we'll send it with our connection too, so folks who weren't able to attend but are on our listserv can have that information too. But thank you everybody so much, and thank you for engaging and for always being willing to learn. We're going to be back on December 18th to learn a little bit more about health and wellness in housing and how there's an important intersection there. And that'll be our last one for the year. And then our first one in 2024 will be on January 8th. So the second Monday of January. But that is all I have for you all today. And again, thank you, Michele, for joining us. And thank you, everybody else, for being here and for being engaged. See you in 2 weeks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rakesh and Ms. Thompson.